are live, so we'll get all of you and the panel. We are live, so we'll get
I assume all of you have signed up for our email list, but I'd like to remind everyone again that you can sign up to get updates through our mailing list right
we
here.
are live, so we'll get
I assume all of you have signed up for our email list, but I'd like to remind everyone again that you can sign up to get updates right from our mailing list right
we are
here.
live, so we'll get
I assume all of you have signed up for our email list, but I'd like to remind everyone again that you can sign up to get updates right from our mailing list right
we are live, so we'll get
I assume all of you have signed up for our email list, but I'd like to remind everyone again that you can sign up to get updates right from our mailing list right here.
live, so we'll get
I assume all of you have signed up for our email list, but I'd like to remind everyone again that you can sign up to get updates right from our mailing list right here.
live, so we'll get
I assume all of you have signed up for our email list, but I'd like to remind everyone again that you can sign up to get updates right from our mailing list right here.
live, so we'll get
I assume all of you have signed up for our email list, please I'd like to remind everyone again that you can sign up to get updates right from our mailing list right here.
live, so we'll get
I assume all of you have signed up for our email list, please I'd like to remind everyone again that you can sign up to get updates right from our mailing list right here. On Fridays, you can sign up for our email list, please I'd like to remind everyone again that you can sign up to get updates right from our mailing list on Sunday, on Fridays, you can sign up for our email list, please I'd like to remind everyone again that you can sign up to get updates right from our mailing list. Panel is structured so that on Sundays, on Fridays, panels have then 4 minutes to respond to in the same panel structure. The floor will then be structured by the questions from those who are here in the room. Prioritize panel questions then online also to respond to. For our online audience, please specifically note that what you're saying is a question. Questions may be directed to a specific panelist or a set of panelists or host the panel as a whole. For our online audience, discussions and question and answers are what you're saying panel questions. I'd like to mention some recent events that include the main panel or panel as a whole. Late last night, the Students for Justice in Palestine at the University of Virginia and 20 other student organizations announced a protest for next morning with the following aims: hands off our students, hands off Gaza, release Mahmoud Khalil, ICE operatives. Protest for next morning with the following aims: hands off our students, hands off Gaza. At the beginning of this month, the University of Virginia celebrated more than 2 centuries of class the next morning. Thomas Jefferson, describing the future university, said from an 1800 letter that it would be a university on a plan so broad the University of Virginia as to be worth past centuries without public support. Thomas Jefferson, the intimidation to the university studies to come and drink of the cup that it will and track the university on a plan so broad. More recently, last semester in October 2024, Pink again and the Federal Guides and Policy Studies and the University of Virginia Optional Engagement hosted a discussion titled Free Speech of the 60s, 60 Years of the Free Speech War on Politics and Where Do We Go From Here, featuring the founder and editor of the Free Press, Barry Weiss, and the former governor of Indiana and former president of Duke University, Mitch Daniels. The Cavalier Daily's October issue featuring the founder and the evening began with a featured screening of a short documentary chronicling the birth of the free speech at UC Berkeley, in which students protested administrators' October issue restrictions on political expression began school in 1964. Further, during the discussion in which Daniels asked Weiss that she would have done different if she were president of Columbia University during the war. Further, Weiss responded that she would also have Daniels enforced the law, unquote, against students who protested. The November issue of the Jefferson Independent responded that it reads, free speech ensures the progression and advancement by the unquote. Free speech also is a conflict resolution. The November issue of the Jefferson free access to a platform where thoughts can be shared. Free speech ensures the progression and advancement by the unquote. With that being said, I'd like to introduce our panelists.
starting with Daniel Tutt, sitting with Daniel Tutt is a philosopher of Marxism and psychoanalysis. He's taught philosophy at George Washington University, the Washington D.C. jail, and Marymount University. Tutt is the host of Manifestations by Marxism, and he's founded study groups on psychoanalysis and politics. He is a co-editor of Vanguardism, a forthcoming special edition on Lukács's The Destruction of Reason with historical materialism, which will be published in 2026. Daniel's first book is entitled Psychoanalysis and the Politics of Family. The most recent book is How to Read with Historical Materialism, Why the Left Got High on the Samuel Amos, Daniel's first book is entitled Psychoanalysis at the University of Virginia. He is currently studying politics and hopes to continue his education by the left got high, researching international relations. Daniel's first book is entitled Product Rules, Spencer Leonard, Virginia, India, is an editor of Marx and Engels on Bonaparte's editorializing selected journalism. Researching, he is also a professor of sociology at James Madison University and a founding member of the faculty affiliate editor of Marx and Engels on Bonaparte. Now here is the prompt for the panel, which shares with the panelists also a professor of sociology, the politics of free speech, and a founding member of the faculty. If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this, now here is the prompt for the change its republican form. Let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion if there be any where reason is left free to combat. Thomas Jefferson, first inaugural address, March 4th, undisturbed as monuments of the safety. From the Sedition Act of 1798 to the Sedition Act of 1918, the right to public speech has been applied to politics of the state. The 1789 Act was authorized under John Adams' 1790 as a means of prosecuting and convicting members of the Jeffersonian press for their support of the Jacobins in the French Revolution, and to further criticize the Adams administration. Well, the 1918 Act was authorized members of the Jeffersonian press as a means of prosecuting and convicting Socialist Party leaders and the presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs for his speech in Canton, Ohio, which called for turning the inter-imperialist war to a class and convicting Socialist Berkeley Free Speech Movement. The New Left took up the banner of free speech as a starting point for politics. In light of this, we ask our panelists to ask questions. Socialist Berkeley Free Speech. What is the importance of civil liberty, especially freedom of speech, starting point of freedom of society? 2. What is the relationship of socialism and civil liberty? 3. Why has the left suppressed or supported free speech? And what distinguishes it doing so from the right? In what way is socialism a concern for the left? 3. How is it concerned distinguished from that of the right? And what distinguishes it yet a pen I realize I in what way is socialism a concern for the left? 3. How is it concerned distinguished from that of the right? And what distinguishes it yet a pen I realize in what way is socialism a concern for the left? 3. How is it concerned distinguished from the right?
I suppose I'm going to address the third about how to understand not so much the difference between right and left forms of curtailing, but I want to actually start with Karl Marx's first really published article in forms of curtailing. But I want to actually start with Karl Marx's first really published just about a couple of really decades before Marx publishes this Immanuel Kant, which is a very important philosophical treatise called What Is Enlightenment? And this is a short, very readable, very interesting, very important treatise called What Is Enlightenment? Statement, which has, I think, a lot of, this is a short, very basic, very interesting, how the public sphere very treatise called What Is Enlightenment? So as to ensure, this is what Kant called public visible, and one of the things that Kant says that's often overlooked, so as to ensure, is that what Kant called public visible. There is one of the things that Kant says philosophy educate masses of people out of their self-imposed maturity, and that this process requires a rational despot educate mass society, self-imposed. And it just so happens that when Karl Marx, as a young journalist, couldn't find a job after he finished his dissertation, and it just so happens that when Karl Marx, there was a new king who couldn't find a job qualified his dissertation as rational despot, who promised that there was a further speech qualified. And so the liberal intelligentsia that Marx was engaged with at the time perceived this as a great progressive cause. There was for a more emancipated society for the enlightenment. So the liberal intelligentsia, the reason to flourish, perceived this as a great progressive. But that's not what happened. For a more back to Marx encountered a liberal, so the liberal intelligentsia sphere that was quite censorious. And this led Marx very quickly to hold Marx's view that the rational despot philosophy is the citizen ultimately. And this led to social order, a liberal social order, that only intensifies that the rational despot philosophy is the citizen ultimately. And so Marx ends up with a very bold position, liberals, that this relies on the rational despot philosophy. And so what this does is it infantilizes the position, liberals, that what it also leads to is the type of liberal gatekeeping. So when you ask, what's the origin of censorship on the left? And so I think Karl Marx's early work actually gives us a lot of insight into sort of a historical repetition. So when you ask of liberal bourgeois society that we still deal with, and that is based on this Kantian, what we might call détente, that was forged between the rational despot, the state, and the Marxists. Now, of course, the young Marxists have this inherent, what you might hear, thought out theory of state power between the rational. But what he does know is that where he is doing his journalism, of course, the young Marxists, the censor basically comes in and shuts down the whole thought out theory of state power between the rational. And it ends in a disaster. And what Marx is doing his journalism, these angles a couple of months later, is that advocacy comes in and shuts down, is a strident anti-censorship position. And it ends in a disaster. And what Marx is doing his journalism, and what that means, and this is something I think is the hallmark of Marx, is a strident theoretical independence for the cultivation of theoretical output. And what that means, and this is something intellectual hallmark of Marx. And this notion of independence also means that workers themselves must have a theoretical output from this pollution, and this no censorial public sphere, precisely because the liberal public sphere is content to comply with censorial pollution. Now, I've recently written a foreword to a forthcoming book, Flowers for Marx, edited by Conrad Hamilton, and features essays from Immaculate and Virgil. I've recently written, and I was compelled to research what Marxism has to say about censorship by Conrad himself was. Features essays from Immaculate and Virgil. And I was compelled to research and know what Marxism has to say about one of the authors wrote as a socialist for a publication. And I was compelled to research and know what to be a kind of red brown publication, and moreover another author appeared on the Joe Rogan show. And now, one of my panelists, Spencer Levitt, and I have debated red brown publications, and moreover another author appeared on the Joe Rogan show. Certain things like, and now, one of my panelists, Spencer Levitt, and I have debated red brown publications. Where did Kamala Harris get the idea that in order to go on Joe Rogan, that would influence Joe Rogan's platform, right? Where did, as opposed to perhaps a different view, which would actually, in order to that Rogan is up for grabs, I think, in fact, Rogan is some kind of perhaps a different view, liberal pluralism and straight play is up for grabs, I think. So Marx called this complicity censorship on behalf of liberal intellectuals. He said that it was already pseudo-liberalism. So what I find interesting is that oftentimes on the left, we have these faux pas, these assumptions that are not rigorously interrogated as to how we are conceiving of our political ideologies. I would contend that a lot of the impetus that circulate orthodoxy that circulate on today's left political ideologies represent in some cases a kind of influx that a lot of the impetus that circulate almost a kind of apologetic that circulate on today's left political ideologies. The views represent in some cases a kind of influx that a lot of, so there is a kind of inflexibility, perhaps even intolerance to the notion that our views can change, right? And that we can be the catalyst to change others' views. So there is a kind of, and I think this is actually something that should be from all our tolerance and Marxist practice. The notion that our views can change without falling into some type of fetishization. And I think this is actually free speech or liberal pluralism for the sake of the practice. Our views can change. Because I think one of the things that Marx realized was that error of this Kantian idea of reason is that it will be beholden to state market interests. Because I think one of the things, so what I developed is a theory of what is clear of this Kantian idea of what's called the counterpublic. Is that it will, and the counterpublic, I believe, is one of the ways. So what I developed is a theory of what of this independent thought, what's called the working class. And the counterpublic is a task of socialists precisely because these issues of censorial practices are very, very, very pervasive. We need to also at the same time not give into what I call the censorship complex, in which we excuse one form over the other, right? So we need to, as socialists, I think, really think carefully about confronting some of these legacies of no platforming. We need to think carefully about whether we are turning people to the right, right? By no platforming people in a perfunctory way, right? So I've been involved with left-wing debates on this issue in the last few years, since about 2021, since I started really publishing. And in the Q&A, I'd love to engage with you all a bit more about what I've observed. I don't know how much time I have left.
1 second, please. You have 5 minutes.
Oh, cool. Because you see, how is all of this connected to freedom of speech? Well, I think for Marx, it's in a certain sense deeper than just freedom of speech. It's connected to the possibility of freedom of thought and therefore to intellectual emancipation itself, right? So in a certain way, all of these things we need to think through very, very carefully, while not pandering to a type of false pluralism which would take reactionary ideas as inconsequential. Now, reactionary ideas have a weight, they have a valence, they are real. We were just talking in a coffee shop about the fact that this city was, under the first Trump period, the home to a white supremacist rally that had national news and all of that. And so we need to think very carefully about what it is that, what are the kind of pieties of mainstream left liberalism, and how do they relate to the socialist tradition itself? Because again, I'm really thinking that the socialist tradition must work on this idea that is extended into the field of intellectual thought, of the independent organization of the working class, that this also necessitates some independence from the dominant publishing industries. Part of this also has to do with originality of thought as such. When we don't have independent thought, we fall into status quo thinking, right? We fall into a situation where we have a kind of
uncritical relationship to systems of power. One of the things I'll say in conclusion that concerns me, frankly, is that in critical humanities, in critical theory, psychoanalytic thought, post-structuralism, stuff that I studied when I was doing my dissertation and that I'm still very interested in, there has been this, I don't know how many of you all are aware of this, what is sometimes called the turn from critique. In other words, there's been a tendency in what is often called the reparative turn in critical theory to move away from a paradigm that would be actually interrogating systems of power in a kind of rigorous way. And what you end up getting is a kind of milquetoast analysis of social power. And if that then becomes kind of like the fad, or if that becomes sort of like the norm, I worry that we lose our edge of actually truly interrogating systems of power. And so again, I try to theorize in the foreword to this book, Flowers for Marx, what it would look like to have what I call a workers' counterpublic, in which rigorous thought is capable of having a certain independence from some of these pieties. Because there's a lot of ways in which there's a certain disingenuousness that marketized left liberal thought imposes. Boundaries of what's acceptable to think. And I've written elsewhere that this also poses a danger of what I call the dissident trap, where because liberalism is in a pretty profound crisis intellectually, morally, and so on, there's also a risk for socialists to fall into a kind of bad infinity where all we do is criticize that, right? So we also have to have a positive project, a positive program that we build from, and not fall into a constant, because, for example, Compact Magazine, I read as a very strange ideological agenda. I don't even really know if it's quite coherent, but it very much has this kind of dissident for dissident's sake intellectual production. I think that the task, in my final point, would be to still follow this young Marx notion that theoretical production is important precisely because the power of the state and the market fetishize social reality. So Marx actually says workers need intellectuals to have independence from that in order for workers to get a better grasp on social reality itself.
Thank you. In order to talk about civil liberties in a modern context, I want to establish a foundation for how these liberties are currently understood in our society. Currently, there is an attack on free speech happening on different campuses in the United States. The detainment of Mahmoud Khalil is an example of this. The Palestinian movement has been labeled as anti-Semitism by a warlike Trump administration, and they're using the blanket label of anti-Semitism to detain and deport Palestinian activists. This is a violation of basic free speech principles. In order for society to be truly free, its residents must be able to protest freely and fairly without risk of retaliation. Currently, support for the Palestinian cause can be met with these false accusations of anti-Semitism, and that is egregious. That being said, the state of civil liberties in the United States is abysmal at best. Even before the Trump administration was outright trying to deport people for their pro-Palestinian actions and beliefs, the Biden administration was allowing for universities to send SWAT teams to mace and arrest students for protesting a genocide in which we are complicit. I was maced and punched in the face with a riot shield for protesting our own university's complicity in the atrocities being committed by the Israeli Defense Force. The United States, which has been heralded as a beacon of free speech principles since its inception, has become an entity reliant on Stalinist tactics in this era of AIPAC-dominated politics. Historically, capitulating to fascism has never worked, and yet we still see Colombia's administrative board bending the knee to the Trump administration. A free society needs a robust system to protect its civil liberties, but the American system isn't free and is beholden to the AIPAC lobby. Where does this leave socialism? Originally, I would have said the Palestinian youth movement was the vanguard of a youth movement that socialists could point to when confronted with the question of the vanguard. But now, in the wake of a Trump victory, I believe that socialism has been left behind in favor of a reputation-reliant organizational crisis for the socialist movement in the United States. After the initial foray of encampments, the original planners to the Palestinian youth movement lost their momentum. That and the election highlighting a significant amount of non-college educated youth having been taken by a rising tide of fascist politics. This was the Achilles heel of our movement. While we saw much support from students on college campuses, a much different story was unfolding in the non-college educated middle class Gen Z's mind, one of misunderstanding and eventually capitulation to fascist rhetoric. I know people personally who voted for Donald Trump because he provided an economic alternative that was worthy compared to the Democrats. This is where socialism failed in response to the rising tide of fascism. Our vanguard was unable to appeal to the working class of this country, and that was reflected in the election results. Socialism is in a precarious position because the vanguard movement, which originally attempted to spread a version of it throughout the encampments and beyond, did not reach the American middle class. Rhetoric about economic stagnation caused by rampant immigration won over the middle class faster than any pamphlet or newspaper about new socialist policies ever would. Our own civil liberties relate to socialism in the sense of how our politics informs which civil liberties we possess and which we do not. In the face of the Palestinian movement, the civil liberties afforded to us are little to none, and socialism is the alternative which we must use to build power. Those who voted for Donald Trump believe that we possess more civil liberties than we've had, and this is yet another failure of the vanguard Palestine movement, a failure to politically educate people en masse. Like my panelist here was saying, is another result of socialism and civil liberties not finding a true common ground in this country. If there was a common ground, then the bridge to the average Trump supporter would have been built in 2018. Speaking to the average Trump supporter, you'll swiftly find yourself in a spot. It is likely they will list some acutely radical things about the upper class of this country, and maybe even something that makes you believe they will be in solidarity with you. Then you arrive at the cage, which is American politics, and they will, without a doubt, let you down. In the cage of American politics, there are only two options to the median voter. While there are options beyond the two-party system, the existence of two well-seated, incontestable parties sway the median voter only in two directions, left or right. And that is why socialism and civil liberties are not intertwined currently. No amicable, across-the-board alternative for socialism means that the civil liberties we're asking for are left with the average American's conception of what freedom is. And the left has championed a new kind of free speech in pursuit of aiding the Palestine youth movement, which has invited retaliation from the powers that be. While the right is partaking in petty attacks on immigrants in pursuit of an economic agenda, the left found a new avenue with which to use our civil liberties. Protesting in support of Palestine has allowed the left to be suppressed in a way that we have not seen in the United States before. While the government has destroyed left-wing political parties before, like the Panthers, never has a vocal activist been outright deported or attempted to be deported for their actions on U.S. soil. This signifies a new era of American politics where one's belief can land them in a deportation cell. The pursuit of Palestinian sovereignty in the U.S. has found the opposition moving to use anti-Semitism as a shield, all while the far right has grown disturbingly more anti-Semitic. Revolutionary forces within the U.S. have all but failed to educate the median voter, and while the encampment succeeded in getting attention on the vanguard, there was little to no congressional progress made by these encampments. The calls for disarmament went unheard, and yet Netanyahu is still in power. The encampments seem to have a ratcheting effect on the election, with encampments pulling voters away from Democrats. This gave Trump a lurching advantage in the election. The right was able to use anti-immigrant propaganda to sway median voters towards the red side of the ticket, and the left has been the only true supporter of free speech in the U.S. since the beginning of the Palestine protests and in the aftermath of the Trump protests. It remains the only entity concerned with protecting free speech, with troops on the left moving to protect Mahmoud Khalil and other left-wing activists from attempts to arrest and deport them. All of this has left socialism in a bit of a state in the U.S. with the failure of the Palestinian youth movement to appeal to the young, non-college educated voter base. We are now in a lull. The protests are still happening, but at nowhere near the prevalence of which they were occurring in May. Now the left has to answer for the failure to appeal to the American worker and organize appropriately. We have to find ways to reach into rural communities and find ways to break up the power that Trump has within the working class. With a newfound precedent for cracking down on left-wing ideology, organizing the socialist movement is going to take new ideas to pull through this crisis. A new vanguard must be formed, or the current vanguard, the Palestinian youth movement, must be improved to account for the non-college educated working class of the United States.
Right. I might differ from my fellow panelists on a couple of points with respect to the free market and free speech, and with respect to really where we are on the left and the pro-Palestinian movement, where it sort of is historically. But mainly I'm going to give you guys a discussion of liberalism with respect to our university, our founder of our university. I was a student at this university myself. I was politicized here about 3 decades, or 2.5 decades ago. Oh, no, 3.5 decades ago. And what we call the legacy of the Constitution and the left's relationship to that. So it's a great pleasure to me to be speaking on Platypus panel at my alma mater, where I've both attended and taught. It's a particularly special treat to be speaking on the subject of free speech at Mr. Jefferson's University, one of the few universities in the world to be unequivocally founded on revolutionary ideals, however much those have been produced in the university's history. And the prompt for this panel, the Jeffersonian legacy, is specifically invoked. I therefore want to begin with a quote from Jefferson. "The people are the only censors of their governors. Even their errors tend to keep these governors to the true principles of their institution. To punish these errors too severely would be to suppress the only safeguard of the public liberty. The way to prevent irregular interpositions of the people is to give them full information of their affairs through the channel of the public papers, and to contrive that those papers should penetrate the whole mass of the public. The basis of our governments being the opinion of the people, the very first object should be to keep the right of free speech. And were it left me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." Jefferson, of course, was among the greatest, if not the greatest, of American revolutionaries. Indeed, of all revolutionaries of the bourgeois epoch. He was wholly conversant with British revolutionary history. He absorbed as mother's milk the Enlightenment radicalism expounded by his philosophical mentor, the Scotsman William Small. And that at a time when all of North America was abuzz with the possibilities opened up by the defeat of absolutist France at the battles of Quebec and Quiberon Bay. As the ghosts of great Republicans like John Milton, author of the great 17th century defense of free speech, Areopagitica, and of the great Whig revolutionaries such as John Locke, rose from their graves to applaud and bless the victory of the English Revolution on a world scale. A 17-year-old Jefferson discussed with Small and other men twice his age or more their writings, that is Milton's and Locke's writings, and the new writings pouring out of Edinburgh and Paris, and ultimately the wide-open prospects of the second half of the 18th century. A member of an astounding generation that counted among its number Thomas Paine, the Marquis de Sade, Jean-Paul Marat, Ludwig von Beethoven, the great astronomer William Herschel, the naturalist Joseph Banks, the chemist Lavoisier, the Indologist, dear to my own heart as a South Asianist, William Jones, painter Jean-Louis David, Johann von Goethe, Jeremy Bentham, Joseph Priestley, the Marquis de Condorcet, and the abolitionist Granville Sharp. Age of enlightenment, indeed. Speaking of which, we do well to recall that it was in the immediate wake of the signing of the Treaty of Paris that secured American independence. Here I'm going to differ from Daniel. That Immanuel Kant wrote his classic defense of the right of free speech, his essay, What is Enlightenment, in 1784. In it, Kant defended free speech as indispensable to the project of changing social practice and thereby changing human nature, giving ourselves a new nature in history. Argue as much as you want, but obey. That is to say, obey the law as you debate its alteration. Act in accordance with the acknowledged law, even as you debate how it must change to meet, to acknowledge and give scope to the new practices history itself is giving rise to. Because only through argument can this be done. No amount of private reflection, no matter how cultivated, no matter how learned in the wisdom of the past, can substitute for discussion and debate with one's own contemporaries. Only in this way can that striving for consciousness of the general will that Kant terms public reason prevail. He would have concurred wholeheartedly in Jefferson's preference for newspapers without government. And indeed, Kant, no less than Jefferson, anticipated the day when man would no longer require any sort of master. There's a reason why Jefferson directly inspires the first stirrings of socialism in America, abolitionism, and is later claimed by both the Socialist Party and the Communist Party of America. But to return to Jefferson, as is well known, he, in his 1787-88 correspondence from Paris with James Madison, urged the inclusion in the recently ratified Constitution of specified fundamental rights. And this correspondence eventually led his young protege to propose a series of amendments. As Jefferson wrote to Madison, for most of human history, humanity had lived under despotism, under what he called the government of wolves over sheep, compared to which it would be infinitely preferable to live, quote, without government, as among our Indians, unquote. It is from these deep-rooted aspirations towards anarchy that Jefferson looked for the enriching of American life by the incorporation of its formerly hunting and gathering native peoples. Under such tutelage from afar, Madison rose in Congress to propose the Bill of Rights in June 1789, the same month in which the representatives of the Third Estate and their friends from the other estates swore in the tennis court oath in Paris to form a national assembly and to give France a constitution. 2 months later, Jefferson collaborated with l'Abbé Sieyès and the Marquis de Lafayette to draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Back in America, the entire debate on the Bill of Rights, eventually ratified in 1791, was fully simultaneous with and cognizant of the initial revolutionary stirrings in Paris. As what Jefferson and Madison considered to be a party of counter-revolutionaries, waded ever deeper into their quasi-war on revolutionary France during the misbegotten presidency of John Adams, the great Virginian revolutionaries formed their anti-party, the Democratic Republican Party, to defend the revolution. Already, the Alien and Sedition Acts as the National Archives website explains, raised the residency requirements for citizenship from 5 to 14 years, authorized the president to deport aliens, and permitted their arrest, imprisonment, and deportation. The Sedition Act made it a crime for American citizens to print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writings about the government. The laws were directed against the Democratic Republicans, many of whom were new citizens or immigrants. The only journalists prosecuted under the Sedition Act were editors of Democratic Republican newspapers, unquote. In 1798, the Democratic Republicans announced their grounds for opposition to the Hamilton-Adams clique in the so-called Virginia and Kentucky resolutions written by Jefferson and Madison, in which they roundly condemned the Federalists' betrayal of the Revolution and its recently ratified charter, the Constitution. As they wrote, the people could not but reprobate, quote, the palpable and alarming infractions of the Constitution in the two late cases of the Alien and Sedition Acts passed at the late session of Congress, unquote. Why? Because the Alien Act, quote, exercises a power nowhere delegated to the federal government, and more importantly, does so, quote, by uniting legislative and judicial powers to those of the executive, and thereby subverts the general principles of free government. And the Sedition Act exercises in like manner a power not delegated by the Constitution, but on the contrary, expressly and positively forbidden by one of the amendments thereto, the First Amendment, a power which more than any other ought to produce universal alarm, because it is leveled against that right of freely examining public characters and measures and of free communication among the people thereon, which has ever been justly deemed the only effectual guardian of every other right. Even as our sister revolution in France was entering into crisis and the Second Coalition was being forged to make war against it, in America, the crisis was met by, of all people, revolutionary Southerners, or at least their leaders, like Sieyès and Lafayette in France, but in the far more salutary conditions of the New World, Jefferson and Madison fought, ultimately with greater success, to preserve and bequeath to future generations the legacy of the revolution. Of course, though yesterday the administration brought new accusations against him, President Trump has recently invoked the Federalists' Alien Act to deport purported gang members, and laws in the spirit of that act to deport Columbia pro-Palestine leader Mahmoud Khalil and Georgetown Pakistani student Badr Khan Suri, seemingly for the crimes or misdeeds of Suri's wife. In the 1790s, the revolution had to be renewed in solidarity with the French Revolution and on the ground of free speech. That defense of the revolution was ultimately vindicated, of course, as everyone knows, in the so-called Revolution of 1800, when Jefferson was elected in what would prove the first of 6 straight elections won by the Democratic Republicans, electoral victories that guaranteed to the 19th century that the American Revolution would stand as a shining lamp of liberty and as a refuge and a beacon of hope in the face of European restoration. Today, we face the arrest and deportation of friends, classmates, and comrades for speaking against the government's foreign policy, just as was done under the administration of John Adams 2¼ centuries ago. Then the political struggle was to reject the overtures of Britain and to support the fledgling French Republic, and later, yes, the French Empire, against the British-led and financed counter-revolution. Today, the struggle of the American left, inheritor of the American Revolution, is to reject the overtures of Israel and to stand in solidarity with what? The the right of Hamas to advance, quoting our narrative, the document that they've circulated at Columbia University, a national liberation movement that gets its legitimacy to resist the occupation from the Palestinian right to self-defense, liberation, and self-determination, unquote. The American left, the direct legatee of 1776, of 1800, of 1860, of 1863, of 1868, of the Reconstruction, of Eugene Debs and the American Socialist Party, and of at least the best aspirations of the American Communist Party, have degenerated beneath the threshold of the revolution, as if Jefferson's struggle had been simply for the right of national self-determination, as if the American Revolution was simply a war for independence. It is commonplace today to hear complaints that the right of free speech is not consistently defended by either of the two dominant political parties. While Trump attacks the pro-Palestinian student movement, wielding immigration law as a cudgel, the Biden administration undertook a sweeping violation of the rights of anyone, including scientists, doctors, and nurses, to spread misinformation, so-called, respecting the treatment of or public protocols regarding COVID-19.
You have a minute left.
And the spooks and ghouls of the intelligence agencies, cheered on by many who call themselves leftists, knowingly disseminated the lie that the Hunter Biden laptop, which, let it be remembered, demonstrated the corrupt entanglements of the Biden family with the government ruling classes of Ukraine, bore all the hallmarks of Russian disinformation. On those grounds, Trump was countered in the 2020 presidential debate, even as the story itself, while not technically censored, was kept from circulating by the social media companies acting under orders from government officials.
We'll start
Just a little indulgence. Maybe one more paragraph. Just as the Trump administration steers clear of direct attacks on the right of free speech, which Mahmoud Khalil and Badr Khan Suri will still enjoy even after they're likely deported, inasmuch as they'll still be able to publish their views in the American press, so too the state did not actually bar the New York Post from publishing the Hunter Biden laptop story, or say, actually deny the right of Stanford epidemiologist Jai Bhattacharya to challenge the state's COVID protocols. The Biden White House just infiltrated social media companies and pressured them from without to de-amplify dissenting voices, as the Trump administration is striking terror in many members of the university community, students and professors on work visas, students subject to expulsion, if they lose those visas, non-tenured professors subject to termination, etc., including their wives and families, and indeed intellectuals generally, without mounting a direct attack on the right of free speech. Needless to say, the state's stripping people of their most elemental rights, their most elemental civil rights, the right to earn their own living. A civil right so basic that no one would even imagine enumerating it in the 18th century, because they are deemed non-essential workers or because they refuse to take an experimental vaccine, is ultimately much more chilling than what's happening to Khalil and Suri. The aspect of their cases that truly bodes ill is the public and brazen roundup of even those who have committed no crime. Really, in other words, the issue is questions of due process, etc. In this sense, the deportations of Khalil and Suri are being used to rub immigrants' nose in the fact that their foothold on decent and dignified lives, their chance to work, to study, to participate in society can be revoked at any time. The problem is that any attempt to mobilize around immigrant rights today will directly feed into the Democratic Party. Not that they will actually defend Palestinian rights. It could be otherwise, but almost certainly won't be. I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
These are my general responses to both those questions.
Yes, so you have 4 minutes to respond.
4 minutes? Yes. Okay. Wonderful. Well, I certainly, agree with much of what you say regarding the notion that the left has failed in what you formulate as a vanguard to convince, and that it is ultimately a class communication breakdown, and that you speculate, I think rightly, that Trump has been able to seize something like the working class, although sociologically I'm not comfortable to define the working class purely on income and education. How we derive a coherent theory of the working class is a whole other debate we can have. But this notion that which connects to Spencer's point, that the left has a duty, I have the sense there's a moral duty perhaps to the Palestinian cause, and I think that is certainly a point where I think Spencer and I will disagree, which is that there is a profound historical legacy of oppression that U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East has entangled itself with, has perpetuated what emerged on October 7th, the horror of October 7th, which, due to that entanglement, which is not reducible to Israel-Palestine alone, but which is tied into much bigger geopolitical stakes. As a result of that, you see the condition that the Palestinians are undergoing becomes a kind of centrifugal, symptomatic point of the geopolitical region, bound up with imperial interests of the US state, and added to which we have a genocide. We have a genocide that the international community has declared to be a genocide. And so we run into a sort of question, which is, why is it that only on elite college campuses this genocide can be presented as the rallying point for what you call the vanguard of the left? Well, I think we need to introduce another concept here, which of course is propaganda, right? And the layers of propaganda on the one hand. On the other hand, to Spencer's point, the Democratic Party has a sort of organic machine of radicalization that it foments, that it puts onto young people. And I think one of the points that I was trying to raise was that the task of socialism is to come at the Palestinian cause from a different angle than the Democrats come at it. To situate it as a cause bound up with labor, but also as bound up with imperialism from a global perspective. It's not only a humanitarian crisis, it is a profound, long-lasting wound of the post-war structure of power across the region. And you have to take it from that standpoint, while at the same time recognizing that it's also not reducible to Hamas, that the solidarity of the campus protests in solidarity with these two cases of these two gentlemen that are unfortunately getting deported, Trump is opportunistically using that because he knows the effects that it will have. It will make the optics look very bad for the Democrats. He knows that it will. So bourgeois politics has us in a kind of vice. Socialism needs to get out of that vice. While we get out of that vice, we cannot pander to some false idea that Hamas, or that supporting the Palestinian cause ties us to being champions of Islamism. That is a canard of the right, and I do not believe that is the best way to see the situation. We need to historically ask why that has come about. Why is Hamas in power? It's a much more relevant question. And we need to moreover ask, and I'll stop here, why the Palestinians have chosen Hamas. And more importantly, why the Israelis have insisted that Hamas be in the position that they are in, right? That is extremely important, and once we see that web, we can see that it's not so simple as supporting Palestine equals supporting Hamas. That is a coercive narrative that we have to avoid on the left, absolutely.
I like what you said about Hamas a lot, because that is the typical go-to accusation of pro-Palestine supporters is, oh, do you support Hamas? No, 10%. 10 times out of 10. Hamas is still a terrorist organization. October 7th was horrifying, no matter how you measure it. And I think talking about the bourgeois politics here is crucial, because the bourgeois of this country have this kind of propaganda matrix that they can kind of break into. Like, I remember we made a point about Kamala Harris not going on Joe Rogan.
Right.
And I remember when that happened.
Yeah.
And I was like, that is because she is not a part of that propaganda matrix. Yeah, she's a Democrat. Yeah, she's a big one. Yeah, she did not help whenever we wanted pressure for the ceasefire. But because the American right is so susceptible to the anti-immigrant propaganda, letting her into that matrix in that way, letting her sit down with Joe Rogan, a huge platform for these far-right median voters that seem to sway elections, that is why we probably won't see a left-wing candidate on Joe Rogan, because that propaganda matrix is just too strong and too useful for the right. Now, Spencer talked about the Alien and Sedition Act whenever it was originally implemented, and how it's being used in a modern fashion, in a slightly different manner, but it's still being used to crack down on pro-Palestinian protesters. So its original intention is still there and being utilized by the Trump administration. I suppose whenever we talk about like these post-colonial debates, and we talk about trying to reach into the right's educational mainframe and overwrite it and have our own socialist mainframe, my question is, where do we go when the Vanguard fails? And not just fails generally, but just on every metric, it fails to reach the people that they had to, beyond the students, beyond the professors, beyond the people who have the college education. I'm talking about the Trump supporter who will never see life outside of a trailer. Both of these introductions still just make me wonder how the Vanguard failed and how we can improve upon that.
You still have that, if you want to say something.
I mean, I grew up with these folks. I'm from Southwest Virginia. Speaking to them, Lebanon. Speaking to them is it's always a world of just questions, because they'll say every radical thing in the book and like it just make your jaw drop, and they'll be like, yeah, we voted for Trump though, and you're just like, well, where are we? You know, that guy, the grip he has on the white working class of this country, and the working class in general, he won over Latino voters.
Yeah.
I think the question just remains, how do we talk to people?
To Daniel, I tried to raise this in a bit of sort of ad-libbing in delivering my remarks, which is that I don't think that these remarks might sound esoteric, but hopefully in the course of the discussion we'll really be able to integrate them with the more immediate questions respecting the left today. But the question with respect to Kant is really a question with respect to liberalism and how you understand that. And I don't think that liberalism is incoherent in Kant. I don't think that Kant's incoherent, or I don't think he depends upon despotism or an arbitrary moment. I think that he himself is evading censorship and speaking in somewhat of an Aesopian way, to use Lenin's phrase. But I think he's characterizing the regime of Frederick the Great as a Rechtsstaat, as a state governed by law. And it may not have been, but that's the way that he's characterizing it. And in that sense, he's invoking a liberal sense of monarchy from the 18th century. And it's hard for us to realize that liberalism really was expressed in terms of monarchy. Monarchy was the modern form of government for the radical bourgeoisie. And of course, their image for that was the parliamentary monarchy of Great Britain. Right? This was an Anglophilic view that had been most elaborately expressed by the great inspiration for people, really anyone who was an heir to the Scottish Enlightenment or the American Enlightenment, namely Montesquieu. And I think Kant's writing in that vein. And I think what he's talking about is that, or what he's challenging us to think about is that for the bourgeoisie, and indeed I think for us, the question is always, could we make a revolution lawfully? Right? Is lawlessness necessary? And it isn't. And the violence comes from the right. It comes from, for the American Revolution, of course, the king had violated, eventually the king, but firstly the parliament had betrayed itself, right? So the redcoats were called the Parliamentary Army in 1775, in the opening of the conflict. And to the extent that the law is broken, it's because the law is illegitimate, that the law is somehow not the law of society, that it hasn't been arrived at through free discussion in society. And that would always be the point with respect to slavery, for instance, in this country, or to Jim Crow. Arthur Lovejoy's printing press was destroyed. Many other printing presses were destroyed in the United States for printing abolitionist pamphlets and literature. Distributing them in the South was almost impossible before the war. The rights of free speech, of course, of African Americans were severely abridged. Also, other constitutional rights of African Americans, above all, their right to armed self-defense, was severely abridged under Jim Crow. Jim Crow was fundamentally a disarming of Black people. So I think that it's important to hold on to this liberal conception of social change in order to specify its crisis in capitalism. Not because I'm a liberal, I am a Marxist, but Marxism is about specifying the contradiction in our society and how that's expressed in a lawless state, right? A state that has to violate the law, a state that systematically violates our rights.
We'll start the question and answer now. So you can just raise your hand if you have a question you'd like to ask.
For Daniel? Sure. Can you expand on what counterpublic is? How it manifests, like in, just beyond theory, like?
Yeah. Counterpublic is a sort of idea of a flaw internal to the bourgeois public itself, where the bourgeois public is envisioned as reinforcing a type of fraternity of individual strangers that would allow for that individualism to flourish, while not necessarily relying on some kind of dictated intellectual, moral, or religious enforcement of that public. A counterpublic tends to have characteristics that are more ideologically cohesive with itself, right? It's therefore political. It's a political alternative to the bourgeois mainstream public, right? And so therefore it takes on a multiplicity of forms. You could think of it, for example, there's, a great Marxist thinker, Ernesto Laclau, and he works with Antonio Gramsci's idea of hegemony. And he really thinks that the left is sort of composed as sort of a tapestry of counterpublics. And sort of part of the task of the leftist intellectual in Laclau's vision is how we properly unite, right? From the standpoint, not only of like rational self-interests, but from the standpoint of a dialectical understanding of social antagonisms. Because each counterpublic will have it's grounded in its own particularity. And one of the things that I think I would differ with Spencer about is the problem that Marx realizes about universalism, and that the bourgeois public sphere does not become the site for the working class to realize its own proper relationship to the promises of the universal, as grounded in reason as Kant articulated it, and that an alternative needs to be concocted. And I would even say that if you follow the political trajectory of Marx and Engels, especially after they break from the Communist League before 1848 revolution, what you effectively have is a workers' counterpublic emerge. I mean, read the 1844 manuscripts of Marx. He's talking about how the bourgeois public sphere deprives the worker of not only reason, but of their own sensuality, of their own capacity to develop self-esteem, right? So there's something deeply inadequate about the bourgeois public sphere as it is given to us. An alternative must be concocted, right? And it just so happens that, if we take and I'm not a Laclauian, but I mean, I did my dissertation on his thought, and I'm pretty steeped in it. He wants to say that there's a way we could arrive at a universalism through the collective struggles of multiple counterpublics. So that's sort of the idea of it, that it is in a concrete adversarial relationship to the existing mainstream bourgeois public. And then from there, I mean, I've even written recently about how, left-wing Twitter is itself ripe with what I call parasocial counterpublics, where the bond of group cohesion is kind of based on this weird, informality of the internet, right? And I've been trying to theorize the dangers that actually poses to socialist organizing, because there is something noble about the original notion of universal citizenship being realized for the bourgeois public. But Marx, I think, and I probably would differ with Spencer here, sees that as a space where the worker is deprived, where they're made superstitious of the exchange of reason available to them, right? And that then describes the irrationality of things like Trumpism, right? What is inadequate about today's liberal institutions that so profoundly alienate the working class? That's a question that the bourgeois public institutions and the sphere itself cannot answer. Marx would say that's the task for us, to create institutions that can give more sufficient answers for worker alienation. Because one of the things that Marx and Engels are different, that differentiates us from anarchists, right, for example, and many other varieties, is that we do believe in worker education, right? We do believe that bourgeois society fetishizes our own alienation, and that therefore the workers not immediately know their own alienation, right? There has to be a mediation with intellectuals, right? Look at Marx's and Engels' debates with Blanchism, right? Blanchism was this kind of conspiratorial group that believed that the task of the revolutionary intellectual was just to light a match and the workers will follow. Marx and Engels rejected that. And that kind of goes back to this notion of worker counterpublic. I believe Marx and Engels wanted a subtraction from the machinery of bourgeois politics. They saw bourgeois politics as not capable of having a fidelity to its own revolutionary tradition. They're constantly making that problematic.
Can I respond to something?
You have to.
I think we have to get clear about what we mean here. Marx and Engels wrote for the capitalist press well after the 1840s. I've edited two, and I'm working on the third volume of that writing. He wrote in English, he wrote for the biggest capitalist newspaper in the world, the New York Tribune. It was a Republican paper in the United States. So he's not saying you don't write for the public sphere. The question really is, first of all, I think the question is democracy, which has to be introduced as a capitalist form of state and of politics that Marx and Engels are engaging imminently, even before the formation of mass socialist parties. But certainly with the formation of socialist parties, this question of the workers' own public sphere, the workers' own self-education. I don't think we can really talk about that seriously in terms of Marxism, which I think basically embodies the legacy of Marx and Engels, without talking about the significance of parties and inter-party dispute for the political education of the working class. Yes, there's political education just in the sense of like lecturers and intellectuals, right? That there were mechanics institutes in Britain, and there were all sorts of things in Europe in the 19th century, which largely built out of like the kind of latent liberal issue-based, the liberalism of the great questions, right? The abolitionist liberalism, right? The social question liberalism, the India question liberalism, the slavery question liberalism of the 1830s and 40s. So I think that we can't let that be confused with the counterpublic that we're going to have now, which is going to be little sects with their newspapers in the counterculture, and then the supposed independence of the movement, which is actually a wing of the Democratic Party, right? What Americans call the movement, right? Which is to say, a left without a political party. That's what that is, right? And inevitably led by a political party, namely the Democrats. And this would be my only response to Sam, is that the Republicans aren't the right any more than the Democrats are. Just full stop. It's capitalist politics. right? And what this country, like every country in the world, desperately suffers from is the lack of genuine independence in politics for the working class.
Would you like to say something, Sam?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I hear that 24/7. And the left and the right.
You must listen to a lot of podcasts.
All the same, yeah.
Oh, you do? I'm kidding. They're the
but-
only ones saying it. So.
It's the voice haunting our dreams.
And every time I hear it, I want to like be with the left on that, right? I want to be like left and the right. They're exactly the same. They're all capitalists. They're the oppressive class, the bourgeoisie. And you know what? Measurably, that's true. But also, the working class in this country does not believe that. The while we as intellectuals can like acknowledge that there are a lot of similarities between the left and the right, and that like there are politicians on both sides of the ticket that receive millions and millions of dollars from AIPAC. I think Donald Trump receives over 200 million, and Joe Biden receives over like 100 million, something fucking crazy. And I think that separating them right now is important only because the American working class cannot separate them themselves. They can, and it's killing us. Because they see the right as not only the right in contemporary context, as not only the economic answer to their turmoil, but also as a distinctive, different entity from the left. And I've been involved with.
Well, the Republicans are different from the Democrats, right? But we just have to call them left and right, that's all I'm saying. We don't have to say they're the same.
But yeah, that's what I want to say.
Okay, we'll go to another question.
So I'm gonna have two very different questions. One for Samuel Amos. So you use the word Vanguard a lot, and I was wondering what you particularly meant by this, whether it is the Democrats, whether it is socialists, the Palestine Solidarity Movement. I was very confused by precisely what was meant by this. And the question I had for Spencer was to maybe ask, because I think there's something particularly strange or particular about the Palestine Solidarity Movement that maybe pushes up against your view that everything on the left redounds towards the Democratic Party. Because I look at something like, you look at electoral patterns in Flint, in Michigan in particular, where Trump wins the election in these places precisely because these Middle Eastern populations are like, forget it, we're just not gonna vote. So it seems to me that, I would wonder whether or not how you respond to the point that, the Palestine Solidarity Movement has opened up, has really pushed people away even from the Democrats now, to the point where there's nothing to even redound to. So it's almost as if the Democratic Party can't even absorb that political energy anymore, and I would wonder what your possible diagnosis of that might look like. And maybe Daniel could speak to this as well. So those are my two kind of questions.
I'll answer the first question by saying, whenever I say the Vanguard, I mean the Palestinian movement. So, there is a conglomeration of different organizations that we saw putting up the encampments on the or across the country in May. As for me personally, what I think of as a vanguard organization is the Palestinian Youth Movement, which is formerly their name. It's where a lot of the just paperwork we had that got disseminated came from. And they were the ones whenever like we have like some kind of like national call or like national thing to attend, they were the ones we would go to and be like, hey, this is our progress, this is what we've done, this is whether or not we've seen police, this is the administration we talked to. And so whenever I say Vanguard, I do just kind of mean the Palestinian youth movement that occurred on college campuses as a whole, but more specifically, I would say like Students for Justice in Palestine and like the various different pro-Palestinian organizations on these campuses that rallied together to make these gains. Okay. Is that? Yeah. I could say more.
You kind of were sliding back and forth, like during your opening remarks, you seem to use it for a lot of different things. So I'm fine with your clarification. It was just, yeah.
I mean, I would say, in response to your question, look, all politics is dictated by the wreckage and ruin of the left. And leftist rhetoric and certainly the legacy of the revolutionary legacies of American history are the language of politics. One inheritance of the left is this antinomy between anti-imperialism and anti-fascism. And obviously the Democrats were taking up the language of anti-fascism in the election. And yet tacitly, the Republicans could be I would put it this way, a lot of leftists are soft on Trump as an anti-imperialist, right, as a stop the wars guy. I think that that's broadly speaking true of a certain anti-imperialist left. But the left is never going to come out in favor of the Republican Party. It's in the deep DNA of the liquidation and crisis of socialism in the United States. It liquidated into the Democratic Party. Right? The total liquidation of the American left took place in the 1930s, a long time ago, when the working class accepted FDR as, in effect, the head of its movement. And that hasn't really changed. There have been attempts to reckon with that. The most notable one was, of course, in the 1960s and 70s, a kind of farcical reenactment took place with the millennials. And this is where I would make a comment about this business about the Vanguard and Palestinian youth movement. If I may, I really see myself in you as a young person. I'm from where you're from. I went to this university. I took part in a movement very similar to the one that you're taking part in. And it's important to know when the left is over, like at all over. And I would humbly submit to you that it's just completely over. Right? That like my generation lived in the shadow of the boomers in a fundamental way, lived in the shadow of the 60s and 70s. The Zoomers are going to be in the shadow of the millennials. And they're going to try to get you to reproduce their failed politics. Question these organizations, these national organizations and so forth. Because Trump won the political battle to reorganize global capitalism, just like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher did 45 years ago. The upsurge on the left that produced the DSA, that produced a layer of intellectuals like Daniel, a whole bunch of other people in a way that it didn't in my generation. Right? There's just not a lot of Gen X leftists really. They're sort of warmed over, like I was a student of this left academic, or I was a student of that left academic, but not really people who have like experience on the left and you can really learn something from. Like you can learn something from like an 85-year-old if you can get them to really talk, right? If they're still cogent, you might actually learn how to organize the left, right? They actually overthrew Jim Crow, for God's sake, right? Like whatever it was, that was a huge organizational feat, right? My generation, like what? Like Battle for Seattle, right? It's a joke, right? And this history that we're in is brutal and long, and just with accumulated defeats, and to try to hold on to the project of really changing the world, you can't have like illusions about the present. Right? You have to work hard, and you also have to have what a hero of mine calls bourgeois coldness, right? You have to be able to step back onto the shore and watch wrecks confusedly hurled at sea, right? You have to watch the horror of the abattoir of history. And so I would say that you got to gird yourself for the long term, and that means learning from what's going on, like learning from Trump, right? Like what is the law? Right? What's going to happen with these cases, Mahmoud Khalil and Badr Khan Suri? These people will be deported, right? The law is on Trump's side. Immigrants have no rights. They can have they have rights, but their immigration status can be revoked. It can be, right? And it is going to be in these cases, right? The left should never have allowed immigrants to lead the pro-Palestinian movement in Colombia. It is an expression of its infantilism. This should have been led by the squarest looking white frat boy at Columbia, right? These with people who have money marbles and chalk, who have lawyers, and who are going to be able to fight for their rights. To think that the Palestinian cause in the United States needs to be led by Palestinians is absurd. Or at least it should be led by Palestinians, or at least Palestinian Americans. Right? We knew in the anti-war movement that, I told my wife, you're not coming. Right? If I'm gonna go downtown and I'm gonna get arrested, you're not coming. Because you're my precious wife and I'm not letting them take you away. Right? And if you break the law and you're an immigrant, you can be deported. They deported Palestinian, Clinton just deported members of the PFLP. These things, Trump has lawyers. This stuff has all been vetted. He knows exactly what he's doing. It's gonna happen, right? And a great deal else besides. And we have to be prepared for that.
I'd like to, can I say?
Yeah, and I'll then repose the question.
Okay, so a couple of thoughts to Ian's point. I mean, I interviewed Jacques Rancière, the great philosopher of May 68. And I felt like a lot of the spontaneous thinking on the left has this spontaneous quasi-anarchist notion that Rancière said a comment, it will connect to your point in a sec, that what we learned in 68 was to expand the repertoire of anti-capitalist possibility. Right, so we thought like the left is this like bucket of antagonism, we just opened it up further. And then from that general antagonism, which was insurrectionary and spontaneous,
there was a moment of a unity between workers and students. You know, my mentor, Elaine Badiou, right, has this kind of theory of that spontaneous unity, but without a rigorous analysis of the necessity of a working class organization to mediate that unity. So what you effectively get is a kind of view, which is that even Bernie and AOC, right, are themselves already products of the democratic machine, and that we can somehow redo that 68 insurrectionary possibility if the conditions are right for it, right? If the oppression of the past, so we have that phenomenon, which I think is a flawed strategy. The other thing we haven't mentioned here is that the ideological commitment to the particularism of identity politics is deeply flawed when we think about anti-imperialism. Not only for the reason of the optics of like this question of like how do we appeal to the working class and their common sense, and Spencer's point about, well, it should be a white guy as opposed to a brown person. I wouldn't say it that way, but I would say that it's a kind of non-majoritarian parochialism that elite identity politics kneecaps effective anti-imperialism because of that commitment, and undermines its potential as a result. I think that the anti-oligarchy tour, the fact that rhetorically nothing can be mentioned about Palestine on that with Bernie and AOC is extremely tragic, right? In the sense that it shows the hollowness of what institution could enforce them to at least adopt it as a rhetorical platform. And the answer is that there is not one to enforce it, right? So we need to ask, why that is the case. I know the time is limited, so I could say more, but maybe we can do it later.
Yes. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, so I appreciate, if I understood what you're saying exactly, the idea of not resisting censorship in all kind of arenas. And so mainly opposed to you though, I think you two will both have things to say. How that actually goes plays itself out in a practical way. In that, you look at say what Marx and Engels might have been thinking about in some ways of really a big censor, maybe the state, you say, okay, the state shouldn't censor, then maybe editorial boards, But now we're in a day where I think a lot of times when we think about this censorship, we're thinking similar to the Rogan thing of this almost self-censorship from being constantly observed. So in the online space, that's, I think you guys even, right, it's part of our speech, you want to talk about Hamas, you started with, of course I hate Hamas, in case anyone's listening, and even though it has nothing to do with your point about what Hamas does or this moral idea, you started with that.
Well,
so the overall thing, and kind of connected to also point on identity politics, but there's always a limit of where, once an editorial board, it's easy to say these are our standards that we're going to let them go through, but when you get to the level of kind of the social construct of what is acceptable to say, the extreme I guess is the anti-woke saying the R slur.
Excuse me, what is your question?
I think I understand.
I'm getting to the question. So the question is, how do we navigate that, that social element of it, so that we can kind of not censor ourselves, but still not just be kind of saying everything in unproductive ways that harm people, but also don't really add.
Well, thank you for that. That's a really great question. And I want to introduce a concept that I didn't introduce from Leo Strauss, that great philosopher. He wrote a book called Persecution and the Art of Writing. It was very important to me. And he really develops this idea of what we call self-censorship. And what he shows in his study of major philosophers from Spinoza to Maimonides to Ibn Sina, well, if you actually look at the social conditions and the repression of censorship, it makes a lot of stuff that we face
small beans, right? So he asked the question, how is novelty, how is original thought developed? And the truth is that, philosophers would hide it from the censor inside their writing. And there's what is called esotericism. And so there's a way to read originality embedded in the text. There's a great book on Kant and self-censorship, where Kant, the early Kant, comes out in favor of Robespierre and grounds his theory of universalism from that position. Radical left flank of the Jacobins. That then is modulated over time, right, as he becomes more inducted into the apparatus of the academy. So all of this needs a bit of psychoanalysis in a certain way, because there is what I would call a kind of false expressivism, where you gain a catharsis, and this kind of goes to Compact Magazine, dissidence for the sake of dissidence. You gain a catharsis precisely by pushing against liberal bourgeois mores and norms, right? And I don't think that that's in line with Marxist pedagogy or vision of thinking politics. Because we have a commitment to the Enlightenment, right? We have a commitment to reason, we have a commitment to something teleological. There's something that we are constructing and building, right? And I think that there has been a certain nihilism that can take over that we need to be careful of, where politics becomes founded off of prohibition and the joy. It's a very Nietzschean idea, right? A joy found within transgression, almost for transgression's sake. I'm known as a great critic of left-wing Nietzscheanism. Even the motto of '68 was "Enjoy without boundaries," right? So I think that, the funny thing is that the force of history, and Christopher Lasch, one of my heroes intellectually, writes about this a lot, where he actually creates a psychoanalytic theory of of the boomerang of censorship out of the defeat of the left. Precisely because the impetus of the left is utopian. And so you have to throw utopian, whereby are we constructing a society, a future that's totally harmonious, devoid of contradictions, devoid of antagonism? I don't think that we are. I think that's an infantile way to think about what we're doing as socialists, right? Contradiction remains, even as we butt up against the status quo.
I think it's okay to have these reservations, especially now, just so I can understand that I'm gauging your question correctly. You're asking about the left's tendency to be censorial and wishy-washy about identity politics, and you're asking how to be.
Yeah, how do you change that in a productive way that's just not, infighting?
I can speak to this firsthand. When I came to UVA, I joined a leftist organization called the Young Democratic Socialists of America. Now, when I got here, I was fresh off the boat from a community college in Southwest Virginia. I was a big old redneck. And understanding the left as who I was then was difficult because I had trouble trying to parse through why we were so heavily on these censorial identity politics. And now that I'm right here and I'm trying to answer this question, I'm thinking of what you said earlier, how there should have never been international students in the front lines, the protests, and there's and how it should have been Chad from New York who was ready for any kind of lawyering up that might have happened. And I think about saying something like that to the new left. And the
You mean to the present day left?
yeah, it would cost us.
Of course it would.
It still will, because these identity politics, they're really strong, because in capitalism everything else is wiped away but literally what we want. And so my advice would be just always, and I probably don't want to hear this, but always tread carefully. And if some identity politics did happen that you know or is gonna break up the movement, or you know it's just clickiness hidden by identity politics, then say that. Don't be afraid to say this movement is failing for X, Y, Z. I would rather you be upfront, overly critical and vocal than the opposite. So just don't be afraid to say what you want, even if you think that might get you in trouble.
I mean, I would say this operates on so many levels, right? First of all, it completely dominates the space that we're in, right? There's no left in the American universities, like at all, precisely because you can't be a left and observe these pieties, right? You can't be a leftist and just accept, you know, black nationalism and bourgeois feminism and this right-wing national self-determinationism and all this other right-wing bullshit that is just absolutely the de rigueur at the university. You can't publish, you can't get a job, right? It's out, it's completely out here. There's no such thing as an academic left, it's a joke, right? There's no class in the university in the United States on Lenin. And there's no serious class taught by someone who seriously understands Marx, about Marx. Maybe Daniel's class, maybe a handful of others. But, you know, there's a lot of rotten social democrat post-party bullshit classes on Marx, right? So there's that, but then there's really what I think is underlying a lot of Daniel's comments, right? Which is that, you know, the left talks past each other, right? The left is not in any serious sense capable of reason. It can't debate. It's, you know, there's the left is actually full of all of these little sects that are inherited from history, right? That any serious leftist has to engage. They don't talk to each other, right? You know, we were just on a panel, Daniel and I, with a young man from the Progressive Labor Party. And this is the anti-third worldist strain of Maoism that goes back to the original Sino-Soviet split in the 1950s. And even he was kind of he kind of said it, but he didn't really say. He's on a panel on imperialism, right? In which he's going to say, you know, all the third worldist stuff is petty bourgeois bullshit. Like that's what his party believes, right? But he didn't really say it because it's the sectarian organization. Even like what, pardon me for sounding like an old man, even what the millennials and the Zoomers mean when they say Trotskyism is like this wholly undifferentiated thing, or Stalinism, right? They don't know like what that word. They don't know that word means Maoism. Right? Like for Trotskyists, that's what it means. I mean, it's a Trotskyist word. But you can't even have these discussions openly. And so they just operate as if, like, you know, it'll either be like comrade, or you're a white settler, Eurocentric, and I can't talk to you. Right? Like, really, you know, that's what the left is going to think of. That's what the pro-Palestinian left should say to me, right? The pro-Palestinian left thinks that America is a settler colonial project. It thinks that we need to decolonize Turtle Island, right? I think this is crackpot lunacy and absolutely hostile to the American working class of all races, including Native Americans, right? I think it's a complete petty bourgeois, you know, Native American project. And of course, I think it's a petty bourgeois or straight ruling class Palestinian project. Right? I think Hamas is the enemy of the Palestinian working class. That's what the American left should say openly, right? And the fact that Trump is going to, would Trump be attacking the Hamas people if that's what the American left were saying? I think it would be a completely different environment if there was a real left that was actually in solidarity with the Palestinian working class. But the fact of the matter is that amongst the encampment, Mahmoud Khalil's running around distributing our narrative, right? That's what it's called, our narrative, right? Which is a Hamas document in English. You can find it online. Do you think that document gets debated against other strategies for liberation of the Palestinian people, other ways forward for the Palestinian people? No, there's no debate. Obviously, I would say fundamentally, the future of Palestine is with the Israeli working class, with the other Middle Eastern workers, against Netanyahu and Hamas. Right? Can you have that discussion at Columbia?
I saw this, this is it's like, one of the scariest things you can hear is that, there is an Israeli working class, which there is. A big part of the
That they're not all from Brooklyn. That they can't go back to Brooklyn, as Norman Finkelstein says. Fucking ridiculous.
It's a tough question. I think you're much more likely to hear about the decolonizing Turtle Island than you are to be laughed out for being a white Eurocentrist. Is it possible for somebody to look at you and be like, yeah, you're right. Yeah, but that's a 99% chance not gonna happen. Like, it's more likely if you're there to help and you have a legitimate reason to, then they're gonna let you help. I do want to say what you're saying is just reminding me of like how the left has this tendency to bubble certain concepts or certain things that we should be addressing for the sake of efficiency or for the sake of these identity politics.
We have to leave.
Are there questions online, by the way?
None that I can see.
Benjamin.
Yeah, I mean, this is more of a kind of follow-up to Sam. Recently in the DSA, we have seen a dispute relating to the question of a security memo. I don't know how well versed anyone in here was with this question. A lot of it is very technical. But the response from a number of opposition figures in the DSA, figures associated less with Red Skull, but the anti-Zionist working group, or SLATE, or the former BDS working group, has been to accuse the leadership of National DSA of being white settler fascists in relation to this question of how to engage with protest security, for instance. And I think altogether on the left we've seen an exacerbation of this sort of rhetoric about how people engaging with, say, the law or with the Trump administration in terms of something like what Spencer raised, that the position of maybe let's not set immigrants at the forefront as a fascist idea, either this is like this white idea that white leadership is producing.
And the pro-Palestinian caucuses are the ones are your opposition here.
I wouldn't say that that's exactly accurate. It is aimed at the DSA's leadership as a whole.
But these are the pro-Palestinian caucuses putting this forward?
I would say that the caucuses that put forward the security memo would also consider themselves pro-Palestine. This is Marxist Unity Group and Bread and Roses, etc. But the response to this has been, right, this kind of very aggressive accusation of fascism on the Pope leadership. That's not like, we have this kind of DSA left-right cleavage that is often talked about. But this is a big pose, this like, actually all of them, or all the leadership will be like white fascists.
I think in the conversation of free speech, identity politics has a very precarious position because you can't question someone's identity. That's not something you can do. But you can question whether or not they're legitimate as a person trying to maintain or hold power. And I think we're just finding ourselves in this catch-22 again of how do we address these identity politics, this elephant in the room, without upsetting the elephant? Because it seems like trying to draw attention to the grip of power that identity politics has on the left does not get you anywhere good. And it routinely only confuses people more on what the left's beliefs are. I mean, if you ask your average Trump supporter what the leftists are trying to do, they'll just say they hate white people and they're trying to upend them. So, truthfully, I think being able to work around identity politics and being able to see past it in leftism will see it'll be the other end of the tunnel, because we're in the tunnel right now. We don't know where we're going, but we're not winning.
I think that there's been a strong and abrasive deterioration of, really after Camp David, of the possibility of the Arab community concocting something that could rival the financial power of AIPAC. And that has largely collapsed in a certain way. And I think that a lot of the campus-directed activity and BDS itself, which of course I think we should support without question, but where I think it's vulnerable is that it's not capable, especially after things like Citizens United and so on, to amass the sheer cash needed to combat what is effectively a PR war for ideological and propaganda purposes within the United States. And I think that why isn't the left able, just like Marx and Engels would probably endorse, taking seriously that need, that gap of how are we amassing the war chest to run counter-propaganda to the hegemony of AIPAC, right? And AIPAC loves having Hamas in the driver's seat. They certainly do. And I would also add that there's a religious element to this. This is a battle fought in the Holy Land. And the Christian right is silent in the corporate media, but behind the scenes, their financial support for AIPAC is tremendous, right? They're not a visible power force, but they certainly are present. And I think, as we mentioned in a recent panel on imperialism, the left should really have a reckoning about the collapse and the lunacy, the frivolity of liberal elite diplomacy and its incapacity to stop a genocide. As a sheer moral universal cry of humanity, all of the smartest people in the room couldn't do anything to stop it. And then some know-nothing real estate agent went in there and stopped it. That's what happened. How is that possible? I don't think anyone really can contemplate how that, you need almost like a Hegelian world spirit to understand what the hell is going on with that fact. And maybe a little bit of humility as well, right? Of course, that's not to say that the rebuilding of Gaza, vis-a-vis that real estate vision, is at all noble. No, it's probably going to be a lot worse in the long run, right? But still, nonetheless, I think as Spencer said, there does need to be some learning about this impasse of the total collapse in a diplomatic solution, and also an analysis of how the American Jewish community can improve its own counterweight to the force of AIPAC, right? I mean, where's J Street? Where's the Jewish left in all of this? I mean, we know the numbers of the Communist Party in Israel. It is more ineffective than the Communist Party here, in my view. Or Communist parties, plural.
I'm
Go ahead.
gonna just sound like an arch, I am just an arch platypus person, right? There's just no left, right? There's no left, and the left shouldn't dream of being president, and it administering American imperialism. We're not advising the president, we're not advising the State Department, right? The issue, Israel and Palestine is an issue that would be mediated in relation, through our solidarity with Israeli and Palestinian leftists, if there were one, right? We don't need to, the Palestinian question is where the left, goes back to consume its own vomit when there's nothing else to do. We're not going to affect the outcome there at all. The discontent with policy, with the Biden policy, is not why Kamala Harris lost, even in Michigan. It is we're absolutely powerless, and there's 1,000 other things in geopolitics that are as criminal as Israel-Palestine, right? What we have to consider is that we need to build an independent socialist politics in the United States. Right? That's a huge task. That is a huge undertaking, and we don't need to worry about the Democrats' bullshit about the white supremacy of white people or the racism. It's all Democratic Party BS. Right? Of course the Democrats were hostile to white people, right? They run a race racket politics. And they define white people as allies. Right? It's bullshit. Right? It is not working class politics at all. It's about aligning racial minorities with Wall Street and the war machine. That is what it is about. And then you get a bunch of rich white people, which the Democrats which is the only growing demographic for the Democrats, suburban whites, right? This politics, we need to cut ties with this, right? However lonely and miserable and hopeless the situation looks when you realize Bernie Sanders is not going to be our president and no other Bernie, we don't want him to be. Right? We don't want to elect a president to further discredit the name of socialism, because that's all that would happen.
I mean, my remarks were more rhetorical, opposing to the establishment. They were not prescriptive regarding where is the left-wing oligarch that can put a stop to the genocide. And I think we've talked a lot about the common sense of the working class. And I just know from anecdotal experience that you don't need to be a college-educated worker to see the exceptional extremity of what is being imposed on the Palestinians. And it is exceptional, and it is the reason why people are in the streets, and it is the reason why people set themselves on fire, and it is monstrous at the deepest core of what we share collectively of humanity. And the fact that people are numb to that is also a result of Islamophobia, right? So, I mean, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia we haven't mentioned here, but that is an element that has to be thrown onto the table. And that socialists can do all of this more strategically than what the Democrats are willing to allow. And I definitely disagree that Michigan, that I don't know if you meant this, Spencer, but Michigan was decided because of this. And I think that a lot of the numbers on the absent, all the people that refrained from voting, including myself, are definitely attributable to this. I definitely believe so. That Kamala and Biden paid for this heavily. And I think that they deserve to pay for it heavily because of how egregious it is. It's a world historical crime against humanity that's unprecedented in our lifetime right now. Okay? That doesn't change the failure of the left. It still remains a fact. And it's one that should militate us and radicalize us because of that.
Whenever Trump won, I think they called Pennsylvania. And the first, literally the second they called it, I literally got on the phone and I called a Trump supporter from my hometown. And I was like, why did you vote for Trump this time? Or, you know, he was young, not this time, it was his first time being there. And the words out of his mouth, the first thing he said to me was, well, Gaza. And then he started talking about some economic agenda and immigration. But I was like, no, back up, what do you mean Gaza? And he was like, well, Trump will get a ceasefire in Gaza for the Biden administration. And I was like,
My neighbor is the executive director of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. You don't get more senior. And that's why he supported Trump as well, just so we're clear. And he told me, and I didn't believe him, that Trump will bring a ceasefire in Gaza, more likely than the Democrats.
And I've been
I'm sorry, but that is a taboo thing to say, but that is exactly what happened. And we need to find out why that happened, right? You know what I mean?
It's the same reason why people voted. It's the same reason like why people voted for Trump in 2016, because people didn't want to go to war in Syria.
Right.
Look, the panel, let's back up to the question of free speech and civil rights. Look, I think that the question of Mahmoud, I don't think that there's a lot of look. I treat the Palestinian movement as what I take it to be, which is an elite college student's preoccupation. I think that that's borne out by the facts. I don't think it has a widespread, maybe amongst Arab Americans, certainly amongst your neighbor who's very conscious of these matters, right? With my cousin who runs a Palestinian charity, my half Palestinian cousin, it's a major issue. Her husband voted for Trump. I don't know how she voted, but she didn't vote for Biden, that's for sure. The overwhelming issue is the way that the claim to our rights is we are humiliated with respect to our civil rights, right? The state humiliated the American people with respect to its civil rights in COVID. I don't give a damn what the Democrats say. To tell people you cannot go to work is outrageous, right? It is the most elemental liberal freedom to not give a fuck and not depend on the government and to make your own way in this life. And it is the source of working class pride and dignity. It is the most elemental source of the dignity of working people. And they didn't do that on some scientific ground, certainly not on any ground that had been achieved through free speech, right? It was absolute censorship as regards dissent, respecting those protocols, and it was extended. And then they were going to start firing people. The Biden administration was dead set on using OSHA rules to fire people if they didn't get the vaccine. Now that's a civil rights question, people. That is so much, like I said, liberals like the Founding Fathers couldn't conceive of putting that in the Bill of Rights. You have a right to earn a living because no one else is going to save you. And you don't, or if they are, you don't want to be dependent upon other people because this isn't feudalism, right? So that basic fact, I would humbly submit, is why Trump won the election. It's not Palestine, right? If you're talking about people's rights, right, and the infringement on their free speech that it was involved, there's all sorts of ways in which people's rights are humiliated. Now, with respect to Mahmoud Khalil, look, the man was arrested by people with no uniform on, with no badge, who didn't identify where they were taking him, right? It was an outrage. These were jackbooted thugs come in the night, right? And you can appeal to working class people about this, right? And we're just gonna see, it's really setting up the humiliation of workers that's going to take place on a massive scale as the deportations ramp up. Right? They're gonna be doing this to, right, Juan at the taco truck. They're gonna, they've already done it in Memphis. It was a documented case, right? They just come up, they're not in uniform, They just say, come with us, and they're carrying workers away without trial, without even a hearing. Right? This is how you can appeal to people. You don't have to worry black or white, Hispanic, gay, straight. You can appeal to people about the outrage to the Constitution, to the law that they profess. Right? They claim that they're upholding the rule of law. Right? These people have, look, the Democrats created this situation. They demagogued the immigration issue. They brought all kinds of people here as refugees that are not refugees. They're economic immigrants. They set up this whole problem. They're absolutely complicit. They're no better than the Republicans. Right? They didn't want to legislate because they didn't want to say, yes, we're going to keep people out, but of course that is going to be involved in any real immigration reform. They didn't even want to vote on it because our legislators don't vote on anything anymore. But we are in a position where we have no working class solidarity. We can't stand in solidarity with people and say we're going to shut this workplace down if you touch our fellow worker. An injury to him or her is an injury to us. Right? We're not in that position. Right? And so I'm upset about Mahmoud Khalil. I work in the university. I don't want to see in the other cases, in some of this Badr Khan Suri, he's being deported because of his wife. They're using immigration law to basically terrorize his wife, who is the daughter of a secretary of a leader, of Hamas. Right? They can't get at her because she's a citizen, and so they're deporting her Pakistani husband. Right? We could appeal to people apart from what they think about a war that is between two horrifically right-wing forces, as presently constituted. We can still defend the rights to self-defense, the right of national self-determination, the right of the Palestinians to do whatever, but they're presently politically constituted by a reactionary Islamist government. And leadership in the PFLP defers to it. That Hamas is the leader of the national liberation struggle, and national liberation is the be-all and end-all. National liberation is not the be-all and end-all. Right? What the Palestinians lost their national liberation struggle a very, very long time ago. Like a lot of people don't enjoy national self-determination. And there's an immense amount to play for. They could play for their rights as Israeli citizens. They could play for all sorts of things. But the left is complicit with Islamism in absolutely insisting on this question of national self-determination on the land where that question has already been militarily adjudicated. Right? You might as well demand Welsh national self-determination, or Scottish national self-determination, or Basque national self-determination, or Kashmiri national self-determination, or Uyghur national self-determination, or any of a number of, ultimately dozens and dozens of other questions, some of which are hot and some of which are like Wales and Scotland quite cold. Right? But the left has been in love with Kafiyas and Arafats and AK-47s and the armed struggle against Israel for all kinds of reasons, some of which are anti-Semitic and some of which are well-meaning for a very long time. It's just not like I say, you can get people to sympathize. You can get people to sympathize with people's rights being introduced or being violated. But you're not going to meet people's needs, and the left has to meet people's needs organizationally, right? It's not a provincialism to say that the anarchists or even the churches are right about meeting people's needs in civil society as a way of building, right? We need to address people's alcoholism and their drug addiction and the need for job training and education and whatever, marital counseling and 1,000 other real social problems as socialists, right? And that can actually build something, right? The Palestinian question it's a distant and faraway question for American workers. It doesn't address their immediate needs. You can say that that's callous or that it's a moral failing. But, it's the same problem that bourgeois philosophers addressed a long time ago, right? Do I care about the avalanche that kills 1,000 people in China more than losing my finger? Well, in some abstract sense, I would give my finger for those 1,000 Chinese people that I've never met, who might, if I could stop the avalanche by doing it. But there's an immediacy to the question of my concerns. And politics has to be a matter of judgment. We have to have serious judgment about addressing people where they are.
I think we have a question from the online audience, but if someone in the room has a question. Okay, I'll read the question from the online audience. Should politics on the left be focused on the contemporary left? So I take it to mean, should it be the case of the left that it should be speaking to the left as it appears in the press?
Daniel and I talked about this at the last panel. Go ahead.
Yes, I like I was saying in my introduction, the only way we're gonna get material work done is in the contemporary, in the field in which we are currently looking. And if we're constantly looking back, how are we gonna have any kind of meaningful progress beyond this last foray of encampments we had? How are we gonna look to the future and talk about how we can unite these different working class peoples beyond the politics of the left and the politics of the right, and whatever else in between. I think it's crucial to talk about the modern left more than the old left, because there are enough people talking about that. And professor, and you're a professor as well, in like left-wing ideology, and I think that if we are to obtain some kind of material power, material victory in politics, then we have to talk about the now.
I'm fond of this idea that the left should think historical analogs that are particularly pertinent to the conjuncture, to this idea of the conjunctural analysis, which we partially get from Gramsci, but you also have it in Lenin as well, which means that this kind of comprehension of one's time in thought, this great Hegelian notion that is bequeathed to us as a task of socialism, really, necessitates some. I mean, it's sort of like the ABCs of dialectical thinking, and I'm fond of thinking through like what historical moments are that most speak to our contemporary. And the one that I land on the most is from my philosophical mentor Alain Badiou, who argues that we are most comparable in the history of the workers' movement to the pre-1848 period, in which we have a sort of virginal and fragmented working class. Even labor protections are very dismal, and you have a kind of a question about sort of what in political thought we call pre-politics, right? So of course, history is necessary in this moment where we're trying to get a grasp on what could be political. It becomes a question of what qualifies as adequately or legitimately a political moment. Some people on the left, for example, are writing books right now about how the Floyd uprising still remains this event. Almost, I would say in quasi-mystical terms, that the left, that moment, that uprising was the last moment that the left saw itself, right? So that dialectic of the in itself and the for itself is extremely important when we think about history and events. What is it that will trigger a sequence of a collective self-consciousness, class consciousness, if you like,
is something that is also bound up with that question. But if I might go to Spencer's point, if I have a second, you know, it's tricky. I think that there is this ethical, abstract question about utilitarianism, and I think as Marxists we are not utilitarians. But at the same time,
What about the socialists?
well, let me finish, but at the same time, there does emerge in Marx and Engels' thought a sense that the exploitation of wage labor is not to be somehow arbitrarily placed in a position above other forms of oppression. And indeed, as socialists, we should affirm that we do not have to fall sway to liberal identity politics when we note that there are a multiplicity of other forms of oppression, and that the type of oppression the Palestinians are facing is one that moves us in ways that other forms of oppression don't move us. I think one of the errors of the left is that in this elite campus left, right, this middle class left, right, is that they've lost any dialectical conception of how that form of oppression could relate to sunk exploitation of capitalist life, right, which affects workers. So I take Spencer's point strategically, that rhetorically we need to couch things in such a way beyond the moralism of identity categories, right? That's strategic, that's much more strategic than what we currently do. While at the same time, there's a bunch of, speaking of historical analogs, examples of Marx and Engels supporting national struggles where, say in Poland, where there were religious elements that led that struggle, and Marx and Engels could have the good sense to see that despite the religious parochialism of those national struggles, what they could achieve could point to a universalism beyond a universalism they're willing to speak of. Which is why I think that we have to have a careful solidarity with Hamas. This doesn't mean that we need to have some kind of unquestioning, uncritical solidarity with Hamas. We need to understand what happened to Marxism in the wider region, right? We need to turn to the socialists in the wider region and let them lead the way in some sense. I think that's the point of the reconstitution of internationalism.
I mean, the Polish revolutionaries are there with Marx and Engels in Paris, in Cologne. The Polish question was a question of the entire European order and essentially the legacy of the Treaty of Vienna in their era. It's a living question of the state order that they're trying to overthrow. When they address the India question or the Opium War or other questions, they are using them to show the perfidy and dishonesty of the parliamentary order or the ruling order. And certainly the Palestinian question can be used that way. I think that about the question of the present and the contemporary, I think of someone like Adolf Reed, who said with respect to the black question or the race question, the only thing that hasn't changed about it is the way that we talk about it, right? I would say that the only thing that hasn't changed in the world is the way that the left talks about it, right? So I would question whether the left is actually experiencing history, right? Whether we're capable of experiencing history and what the role of organization is in attempting to experience history, right, as a left, right? I think that something like a political party is necessary to actually experience in a cumulative way history itself. And I think what we do is a kind of a kind of shadow play. I think that with respect to the Black question, we live in a kind that the left wants to infinitely repeat the civil rights movement, because the civil rights movement, the left participated in the civil rights movement not just to end Jim Crow, it participated in the civil rights movement to reconstitute socialism in America. It was the road to a new left, and that failed. And so I think it's a superating wound that the left returns to. I think that the Palestinian question returns the left to socialism through national liberation struggles, which was a Communist Party project in the post-war world, which, as we talked about at Georgetown, was not even viable for Frantz Fanon. And it's definitely not viable now. Right? Frantz Fanon was a critic of the idea that we're going to get to socialism through, effectively, propping up a native bourgeoisie, which was going to be the inevitable result of decolonization struggles. Without something happening that he couldn't conceive. It seemed to require addressing the failure of the cosmopolitan left, of the European left, in a way that was not possible, not on the horizon, and he was expressive of that. He was expressing the deep frustration with that historical impasse, with that, as he put it, blocked dialectic. And so I think that we are engaged in unself-conscious repetition through which we regress further and further from a recognition of the task of reconstituting socialism, right? We have to, maybe it's the curse of being a historian, right, of the left and of thinking about it, right? But the 20th century left is a series of ever more opaque defeats. And watching the millennials ring the changes, like it's like they were not going to fail to tick a single box on the new left defeat story, right? They were going to do the rank and file strategy. They were going to proletarianize themselves. They were going to go through the Democratic Party. They were going to have their neo-sectarian Stalinist moment, right? They were going to have their new communist movement, right? That's what we're dealing with now with the ACP and these other groups, right? And it's sad, it's really sad. And you can see the old new leftists kind of, oh my God, right? They're just sort of in shock and horror, right? Did we do this to these children, right? To our grandchildren. And of course, they were reenacting the 30s, descent into Stalinism and the liquidation of the left. And so this question, is, this is why I would say, the left as it exists it may not be the ground for creating the left of the future. Like when you go to the pro-Palestinian rally, why are the leftists there? They're not there for peace or justice in Palestine. They're there to recruit students to their party or to their order. That's why they're there. They're vampires, right? And for crying out loud, that would be why platypus would go to a pro-Palestinian rally, would be to recruit people. We know that this is just, this too shall pass, right? The left orgs know that this is, that they're not going to stop the war in Gaza, but they might recruit some people. Now, I'm not trying to be too cynical about that. As a leftist, I have to understand come to terms with my own sectarianism, or the inevitability or the horror of it, right? That it can't be avoided. But that is what that's what the left's interest is, right? For real. And so I think that we have to be we have to question, like, what would it mean to learn about our time? What would it mean to actually learn from workers today? Right? I don't do that. I'm just a professor, I read books, I write papers, right? But young people could try to develop organizations where they try to find, I don't think we really know, I don't think you can ask the sociologists or the economists, much less the Democratic Party, what are the problems facing the American working class? I can tick off some problems that I know from mass media, like alcoholism, drug addiction, crisis of the family, unemployment, but there's a lot of other things. And the way that those things appear would surprise me, I'm sure.
I think as we're getting to the end of our allotted time, maybe we'll set aside 5 minutes for each of the panelists to give some closing remarks. Spencer, I think that will be your set of closing remarks, so we'll start again with
Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, well, I mean, I am reminded of the 18th of Brumaire in this conversation about the contemporary and the repetition of old forms and play acting and repetitions that are automatic or blind, and the sense that there's something guiding the forces of history which have either a tragic or a kind of tragicomic structure to them. It is perhaps a bit estranging to read Marx in the 18th of Brumaire and feel that you are disconnected from your time. But that disconnect and that alienation, which we've all felt through reading, right, as well as through political activity and the sort of natural sense of the world. People know the defeat of the left through everyday experience with the world. Should humble us. You know, that should be a source of something that humbles us. But at the same time, I think one of the insights of the Brumaire is that a kernel within the tragicomic is rational. There is something worth taking quite seriously in these grand repetitions that is not reducible to the banality of generational categories, but that there is a sort of a beating heart of history that wants to come out of that mask, that wants to come out of that shell, that wants to come out of that fake facade. And so I think that, you know, there is a great essay that, since I'm speaking on a platypus panel, that I know is important to platypus by Leszek Kolakowski, who I don't agree with when it comes to Marxism on all things. But he has this notion that if the left falls into a type of cynical, black-pilled amnesia as a result of these forces of play acting, and it loses its own connection to its utopian vision, which is its founding ideal, then you really won't have a left. And so I would say that we should insist on maintaining that fidelity to crazy things like utopianism, as Ernst Bloch suggests as well, despite the fact that we know full well that a lot of the ways that those ideas are uttered perpetuate the kind of self-defeat of the left, right? So there is that sort of Beckett notion of fail again, fail better, which, you know, I think is interesting also because one of the things that capitalism does is it erodes generational continuity. And so as I get more gray hairs and I age, I think one of the most tragic things that could happen is if this automatic machine of the left and all of its liberal paternalism and so on, if it started to, in which it will, take the wisdom of people that have been around this machine for a while, they take it for granted or they ignore it, that would be tragic. So I mean, one of the things I like about this panel is that we have the wisdom of age on this panel, and we should learn from it. And I think, to my points in the beginning, the censorship complex really does the work of capitalism itself by eroding voices that will challenge the status quo. And so we should always be open to that, especially the voices that are not challenging the status quo merely for the sake of challenging it, but that have something deeply significant to say.
I think that we've heard a lot about the left on this panel and the particular state that it is currently in. My own personal remarks were about the Vanguard Palestine movement and the manner in which this Generation Z left attempted to gain the attention of not only the media but everyone with the encampments that occurred in May. And I think some of the most useful points that we talked about from this panel would be the question of identity politics and where it lies in trying to learn from the Palestinian youth movement and how to address identity politics, not only as a left organization, but also as a person maybe trying to break in to a leftist space. I also believe that the concern of free speech and the left is as pressing as it ever has been, because we're seeing the use of the Alien and Sedition Act invoked from 1798 to right now to detain and deport Mahmoud Khalil and that Georgetown grad student for actions that were not even of his own. The left is in a position to where it needs to learn how to educate the non-college educated voter. The election showed us that while the Palestinian youth movements were amazing at gathering attention, getting the news cameras, and putting out a message, it also showed us that that message can be uneducational, or it can be ignored, or it can outright be misinterpreted. Earlier in the panel, we talked about how we had friends or colleagues that voted for Trump for Gaza. And that just baffled us as leftists, as people that were like, why would you do that? But it's clear that this was an educational mistake on the vanguard movement of the Palestinian youth movement. That we need to learn how to reach these non-college educated voters that thought Trump was their alternative. And the fact that we did not reach them is on display with the lack of pro-Palestine movements we are seeing today. Even though we are still seeing protests, it is nowhere near to the degree of May. And if we are to get to that point again, we will need to rethink how we are spreading socialism, not only as people, but as frontal organizations that people expect to be consistent.
Okay, I think we'll leave the panel there. I'll stop the recording, and there will be an event after. Where we can talk to all of our panelists.